Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. We're going to get back to the virgin birth issue. And if you don't realize it, this is the most important doctrine that is a mistake and should never have been put in the Bible in the 200s. That's when it approximately was put there, between 160 and 200. That's when it was first put there. And the church, the original Ammonite church, reacted violently against it verbally that, how could anyone do this and desecrate the Gospel of Matthew? And they said it's false. And they hired Symmachus, a Hebrew Jewish scholar who's respected worldwide, to say this idea of a virgin birth is ridiculous because it's Isaiah's wife. Just read Isaiah 7, by the way. Isaiah 7:14 is a verse which allegedly says a virgin will give birth. No, it says a young woman will give birth, and it's Isaiah's wife. And she's already had a son. He's mentioned in the prior verse. And then they're going to name this one Emmanuel. And in fact, he is named Emmanuel, and he is born later. And his sign is not a virgin birth, but his sign is that he is going to be, when he reaches maturity, that the king of the south, the kingdom of Israel has split into two. So there was the kingdom of the south known as Judea, and this kingdom of the north was known as the kingdom of the north. And the kingdom of the north was threatening the south, and God's sign to the king of the south was, don't worry, when your son, Emmanuel, reaches ages, Isaiah's son reaches ages between 12 and 13, when he knows right from wrong, that will be the sign when you'll see the kingdom of the north, and as well as the Syrian enemies, will all be defeated, and you don't have to even done a thing, and God Yahweh is going to take care of it all for you. That was the prophecy. It had nothing to do with the virgin, and the sign was the age of the boy when he would know right from wrong. Then the sign would be fulfilled when those two kingdoms were defeated without any effort on the part of the kingdom of the north. But anyway, but if Jesus isn't born of the line of David as it appears today in both Luke and Matthew, then there is no Christianity, because Christ can't be Christ. That means he's Messiah in the line of David. He didn't have a father who was David in the line. So there's something somebody did to corrupt it. And I'm going to show you, you're going to really be shocked. I didn't even know how amazing this was. So somebody said, well, take a look at Alexander the Great. But I don't think anyone's ever really looked at this as carefully, as thoroughly as they should, because if you just read up to a certain point, you stop reading, you won't see the Magi are mentioned too. In the letter, in the scholar Plutarch, he's a priest at the Oracle of Delphi. So he's been the translator for the Python priestess for decades. She works for Apollo, and that woman is actually an anonymous person who, since approximately the 5th century BC, before Christ, she was created as a office, paid, salaried, everything to the government of Delphi, and then later at Philippi. They were sister oracles. And she was to be given the position of basically going into trances. Nobody can understand what she's saying. She speaks in pure glossalia. Nothing is intelligible, and she needs someone to interpret it. Just like Paul's glossalia has a person, you must have an interpreter, Paul says. Same thing in the Delphic oracle religion. And the Delphic oracle's interpreter was, for approximately right around 90 to 120, he dies in the 120s. So basically in that time period, he serves as this role of the interpreter of the Delphic oracle at Delphi in Greece. Okay, so he has some books that are actually survived into the modern era. And one of them is where he does a biography of the lives of both Alexander the Great and Caesar. So we're going to read a little bit of his Alexander the Great episode here. Now, let me give you the title of this video. Alexander the Great, born of a virgin, a God miraculous impregnation, meaning there was no human involved. It was a miraculous, divine, superior God from above birth. The Magi became aware quickly of his divine birth. You'd be shocked. Nobody's mentioned that before. And like I said, I think people stopped reading when they just saw the fact it was a virgin birth. The Magi knew his birth would lead to the conquest of other gods. So they were so impressed by Alexander Great's birth. And then there happens to be long genealogies in the same context, which is kind of interesting, because you really don't see that outside the New Testament version of Matthew or Luke. There's a lot of genealogies, but where do we see that very much in the same way elsewhere? To an audience, if you were the Hebrew original church, the Ebion, would they have any clue what's going on? They can't understand what who's doing this and what was the agenda and why would they make a virgin birth. But when they could see it was mistranslated as virgin, the word alma in Hebrew doesn't mean virgin; it means young woman. Absolutely, no dispute about it. And Symmachus said that in the around 200 A.D., making it emphatic that as of that time there was no other understanding than the word young woman. Okay, but let's continue and we'll see. Now, before I read these accounts to you, I just want to let you know that if you think I'm wrong about the virgin birth, I'm going to just have to tell you something that you may not like hearing, but we need to hear it, right? As Christians, we need to know something. The virgin birth account in Greek Matthew has math errors. And I'm going to do this in a separate video, but I can do a quick recap right here. Greek's Luke virgin birth contradicts the Greek Matthew. Absolutely. They have different fathers for Joseph, the father of Jesus. The virgin birth stories contain self-contradictions. Within their own text, they don't make any sense. They're contradictory. Now, what we've shown in this channel is Syriac Sinaiticus is a Sinaiticus, meaning a text found in the Sinai Peninsula in 1892 approximately, and that was after the Codex Sinaiticus, a different text. That's a Greek Codex Sinaiticus. This is Syriac, and that means it's older language, better, closer to the Hebrew Bible. It's very reliant on Hebrew text. And you can even hear basically the text. When you listen to the Syriac language, you're hearing a lot of Hebrew. Anyway, this has clearly Joseph, to whom was espoused Mary the Virgin, begat Jesus. Joseph begat Jesus right there. It's not how it reads in any of your Greek texts anymore. This text paleographically dates to prior to 160 AD, and Agnes Lewis has a whole explanation that she can put it prior to 160 because of the work of Tatian, things that he had that wasn't present earlier. So, and he wrote in 160. So she can date it paleographically, and that means you don't know what the date of the paper is, or the date of the paper may be later, but you can see what was the original date of the actual words on the page, what when they were first written, even though they may be copied later on other text paper and older paper. So she's dating it in this era well before the real change in the virgin birth edition in the 180 to 200 period. And anyway, and all the language that conforms a virgin birth to this is missing, meaning, Joseph did not know her until. All these things had to be added to the words, just little snippet things to make it look like it was always there, but it wasn't there. And so they're missing here. And you can just see there doesn't seem to be any agenda to the way this is written. It's just written straight out. And Jesus he can be the Messiah because his father is Joseph in the line of David. And it clearly says this is the line of David, as we'll see as we go here real quick. Okay, again, I'm just trying to show you that if you have any doubts of what I'm saying, you should be paying attention to the story about Alexander being a virgin, the Magi, all the stuff, the genealogies. Yes, there's a reason why it matches, because this is added corruptly by someone who isn't clearly inspired and was playing games with us. So anyway, Matthew 117 is where we're going to see the generations from Abraham to David are 14. From David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14. And the carrying away into Babylon and Christ are 14. So it's 14, 14, and 14, right? So the person who does this is supposedly a tax collector. Do you think he knows math? I hope so, because he doesn't. Whoever wrote this has mathematically challenged. Let's put it that way. So if you look at the generations here, you have only 13. But you know what? We're going to give credit. We'll just say Abraham counts for one in this text. But that's it. That would give you 14, okay? But otherwise, it doesn't make sense because it's begat, 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 begat. You can count them yourself. I counted them over here. But we're going to give him credit here. You count the first one in this one instance, okay? But now we go to the next one. Excuse me. Now, David, the king, begat Solomon. So David's already been counted as a generation. So you can't add him as a generation already. He is a generation. So how many generations it is when you do that? Now, to get to the final one, it does now match. So you can see he knows not to count the first David, right? Because it matches 14. Whoever's writing this gets the second set right. Then the fourth one, the third set, you can't count Jeconius, right? Because we see that was correctly eliminated here in the second set, and it came out to 14. So Jeconius is the last person in the last set, right? Jeconius is the last begat Jeconius. So you can't count him again, right? So you have to exclude that. How many generations do you get, my friends? You get 12. And Jesus hasn't yet been begotten. So you don't even have, even if it said Joseph begot Jesus, you still would only have 13 generations. So whoever this is a moron. Whoever wrote this doesn't know what he's doing. And he wasn't even mathematically correct, right? Just showing you how this is so obvious, doesn't have to require a brain scientist to figure out somebody other than God wrote this section. Now, I just want to talk to you about other things that are amazing. What becomes apparent is that Matthew, and I put this in quotes, but this is actually from Genealogy of Jesus by Text Excavation. He did a lot of good work. Had to artificially juggle the names somewhat to come up with his scheme of 14, even though it's wrong. The first group this first group was correct if you include Abraham. The first group from Abraham to David poses no problem. The second group, however, comes out to 14 names only by omitting 3 names. So if you went back to the actual genealogies in the Book of Kings, you see there's actually 3 names. How can you say there's 14 generations when there's actually 3 other generations in the Book of Kings? And that includes Joram, the king Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah, and a bit later, the king Joachim. So there's actually after Joram, there were the kings Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah, and a bit later, the king Joachim, the son of Josiah. And the third group comes out to only 13 names, actually only 12 generations, because Jesus is not listed as begotten in the line of David. Actually, it's only, he missed it. He didn't even count it himself. This is just to show you people are sloppy and don't take time to meticulously go through these things like we must. We're testing these passages for validity, right? They destroyed the validity of Jesus as the Christ because he isn't begotten of Joseph. So we need to find out, are these really there? Because then we can just walk away from Christianity because there's no Christ anymore, which just been a lie. Because whoever is telling us he can be begotten from above and not from Joseph is telling us something that's contrary to God's word, that the Messiah must come from the seed of David. All right, so that text excavation site did a good piece of work here. It points out there are differences between the 2 genealogies between Matthew and Luke. Guess what? Matthew and Luke give different fathers for Shealtiel in the list. Matthew gives Jechoniah and Luke gives Neri. Which one is it? You can only have one father, my friends. Whoever these people are, someone is telling a lie. We can't tell, is it Luke? And I don't believe Luke wrote this. There is no Luke virgin birth account in the Sinai Sinaiticus at all. It's just not there. Some people say, well, it was deleted or was lost. It's just simply not there. So that's a fact. But what we do know is if he said Neri and it was really Jeconiah, he would be wrong, or it could be the other way around. It really was Neri, and Matthew's gospel is written to put in the name Jeconiah for a deliberately false reason, which I do believe is probably what happened here, and that's a whole nother story. Let's keep going here. We just covered 2a. Let's go to 2b. Matthew traces the part of the line through Solomon and the kings of Judah. Luke traces it through Nathan and otherwise an unknown bevy of names, people who aren't even geologically known in the history of Judah, of the Jewish people, not in the Book of Kings or anywhere. 3. The matching names from Abraham to David are easily gleaned from the Old Testament, and even in his solid line of descent, Luke manages to deviate with the names Arni and Admin. If Arni is the same as Aram or Ram, then the problem is alleviated slightly. But I know of no direct evidence for the identification. So you have to just assume something to try to make them fix. Next, Admin. You got to still get around Admin. Admin, on the other hand, is an extra name, no matter how one slices it. One wonders what independent tradition Luke could have had access to that he valued more highly than either the Septuagint or what has become known as the Masoretic. And again, I don't believe Luke wrote this either, because why would somebody why would you write this genealogy contradictory to Matthew if you could see it? So whoever wrote Luke didn't even know of Matthew's gospel. Remember how late I'm telling you the gospel of Matthew was even amended? So Luke was amended somewhere independently, and they probably didn't even know of any text that had yet the virgin birth in it, so they could make up a totally different story with a different list of people going from a different line to 2 different lines. So it's clear as day. So now now that you know there's good reasons to doubt what you're reading is either one of them is reliable. Now let's go look at the story of Alexander the Great. Now you'll be willing to actually maybe give it some credence as a reason for why this is in our Bible, because it's so starkly similar. All right, so we'll go back to the starting point of Plutarch. Plutarch wrote a book called Lives of Alexander and Julius Caesar. And this book was translated by Reverend Francis Wrangham, and this is in volume 5, 1822. And I'm going to read you a little bit from that book about Plutarch in a second, but I went and tried to find something a little more modern and contemporary to explain Plutarch. He came from Caronia, but he lived most of his life in Delphi as the priest to the Oracle of Delphi. He was a priest of the Delphic sanctuary, so says this article entitled that name. For many years, he wrote several works in which we find testimony about the oracle, meaning the Delphic oracle of the Python priestess. such as why Pythia is not giving prognosis is in rhyme anymore. So at one point she stopped rhyming her messages. So kick against the pricks, and when Paul quotes that is what Jesus says, that's a rhyme. See, so that rhyme was a way that she would give oracles, and Jesus of Paul actually gave a rhyme in the Delphic oracle sense. Interesting. But eventually, by 200 AD, she stopped doing that. So apparently, he has to explain that to people. And then he wrote a book about the Delphic epsilon, or the letter E, and I'll get into that in a second. Here's the book. You can find this at Amazon. I recommend you read it if you're interested. It's free on the E at Delphi, meaning the letter epsilon, Plutarch, and you find that interesting. I've talked about it a lot, and you can look up this also online on the E at Delphi, and it's basically explains it in depth. It's something Plutarch uniquely brought out forth about the religion that other people would know. So it was sort of like a mystery he kept that was being kept at the Delphic Oracle, and he was, I guess, he was finally revealing it. Okay, let's continue. Now, who is Mr. Wrangham, the translator? I just want to give you an idea. Like, is he going to be, where is he theologically? Is he kind of off base, or, you can't trust his translation? The Venerable Francis Wrangham, he died in 1842, was the Archdeacon of the East Riding. He was a noted author, translator, book collector, and abolitionist. And that's a picture of him. Wrangham was a well-known and widely read poet, essayist, and translator of Greek and Latin literature. He was an advocate for the abolition of slavery, the education of women, Catholic rights, meaning not suppressing the Catholic Church inside of England, which, where there should be free speech and freedom of religion, but Protestant England was not a free speech country at that time. Freedom of religion, charity schools, free libraries, charity hospitals, and other progressive social ideas. His theology was orthodox. He opposed deists, dissenters, and Unitarians, and supported foreign missions, writing one book on methods for converting India to Christianity. Sounds pretty orthodox to me. Okay, so this is his translation. Someone who you're listening to, and a little bit. It's hard to have a translator take out all of his values, but anyway, it seems like he's doing a straight job. And this is what is the beginning of Plutarch's intro, page 186 of the book I just showed you. And now he begins. In the ensuing part of the work, we shall give the lives of Alexander the Great and of Caesar, who overthrew Pompey. He means Julius Caesar. And as the quantity of materials is so large, we shall only premise that we hope for indulgence, though we should not give the actions in full detail and with a scrupulous exactness, but rather in a short summary, since we're not writing histories but lives. Then he says this later on. Now we're getting into his genealogy first. It is admitted as certain that Alexander was a descendant of Hercules by Caranus. And now we go to footnote 2. Caranus, the 16th in descent from Hercules, made himself BC 814. So the translator is translating a date that's given into our date system. Master of Macedon, and from him Alexander the Great was the 22nd in descent, so that from Hercules to Alexander there were 38 generations. Do you notice something similar about the way this is being written? That somehow it's important how many number of generations. Remember 14, 14, 14 in ours? 32 generations. Something similar to me. The descent by his mother's side is less clear, there being many degrees wanting in it. It is sufficient, however, to know that Olympias was the daughter of Neoptolemus and sister or niece to cousin to Arimbas. Anyway, just a curious factor that there's mention of genealogies in a way that are counted in the number. And that is generally not what you see when you read any of the Book of Kings. They just simply tell you the genealogies without numbering them. And you just simply, if you want, you can sit there and count them. But for some reason in the pagan religions, knowing the number of generations seemingly had some significance, because numbers had more significance. And that comes out of the religion that was created through Pythagoras. Excuse me. All right, let's continue. So now back we go. So I'm going to start back, and we'll skip the footnote now. We'll just read the text straight. It is admitted as certain that Alexander was a descendant of Hercules by Caranus and of Aeacus by Neoptolemus. I can't say it. Neoptolemus. His father Philip is said to have been initiated when very young, along with Olympias, in the mysteries at Thamacrace. Now, by the way, there's one voice in the New Testament alone that uses the word mysteries several times. I'm teaching a mystery, 1 Corinthians. Take a look at the first chapter. And having conceived an affection for her, he obtained her in marriage. So Philip is the father, but you're going to see he's not really the father as we go. He's just called that for the moment. He obtained her in marriage from her brother Arimbas, to whom he applied because she had been left an orphan. The night before the consummation, the night before the consummation of the marriage, she dreamed that a thunderbolt fell upon her womb, which kindled a great fire. So she had this experience. Remember, Mary had this, the light and all that stuff, and that the flame extended itself far and wide before it disappeared. And sometime after the marriage, Philip dreamed that he sealed up her womb with a seal, the impression of which he thought was a lion. So this is a memory of a dream that he had, that what he had done is sealed her womb, and so he didn't consummate the marriage. This dream, most of the interpreters suspected, intimated some doubt of the queen's honor. So he was trying to avoid her embarrassment. Now, you can read that even in the current Matthew's, like Joseph was afraid that people would be ashamed of her or whatever, thinking that, why is she having a child? So you just see the same kind of words are in both passages. And thought that Philip ought to look more closely to her conduct. So somebody's telling her, you should look at her conduct. But Aristander of Telemusus said it only denoted that the queen was pregnant, as a seal is never put upon anything empty. So he believes that when he covered her up, she was now pregnant. So there was no shame, not because it wasn't Philip as the father. It's just whatever it was actually produced. It had a result. Let's put it that way. So that takes away the shame. So if it's a God from above and she actually gets pregnant, now we don't have to worry about. That means it's blessed by God, right? So you can't shame her for something that a God did, and you'll see that's what's going to be said. As the seal is never put upon anything empty, and that the child would prove a boy of a bold and lion-like courage. A serpent was also seen lying near Olympia's side. One thing I need to tell you is the Apollo religion calls these serpents pythons, okay, in Greek, and the python priestess means she was an oracle, would sit on a python, a tripod that looked just like a serpent. And so there's a connection between the Apollo religion and pythons and serpents. It has nothing to do with the serpent of what we think of Satan as in the New Testament. Okay, it's just simply this is a creature who has supernatural authority. However, Apollo was able to defeat the python, the snake, the serpent, and make it serve to spiritually talk to, in a gobbledygook language, glossolalia, to the priestess the messages of Apollo. So the serpent is the conduit of the message. So when she sits on the python, it's a statue. You and I would know it's a statue, but they believe it's actually the god spirit of the python, who is subjected to Apollo. He's a slave of or servant of Apollo. That's how she's communicating and learning all her oracles from Apollo. I digress. A serpent was also seen lying near Olympia's side as she slept, which is said more than anything else to have cooled Philip's affection for her. So he sees the serpent there. And again, he's not thinking it's an animal in the sense you and I do. It's like a spirit from the python who has these spiritual powers, and yet is subject to Apollo. So it's really more an impregnation by Apollo through the python, so that he seldom afterward repaired to her bed, whether it was that he feared some enchantment from her or abstained from her embraces because he thought them consecrated to some superior being. So whatever his reason, his basic feeling was, it's superior being to me, I'm not going to mess with her. So he didn't have any more relations with her. And a lot of people think that Mary never had any other children, just to show you, because of the same concrete idea that we have to follow this myth by Alexander to the T. Somehow it's in our brain that, she shouldn't have had any other children. But clearly all the other children are definitely children of hers through Joseph. Okay. And one of the reasons we know that is Epiphanius tells us in the 300s that the reason James had all the authority to run the church was he was the second born. And therefore he was, when Jesus died and resurrected, he was no longer on earth. Right. So when a king's the actual king leaves and departs, goes to heaven, what happens? The next in line is called the suzerain position, and they become the next in line. And James was the next in line to be king of Israel. You see? And that's why Epiphanius, who was uh, uh, very intimate with he was from Palestine, he spoke Hebrew, he probably was able to read the Hebrew Matthew. He knew why James had all this authority, and that's what he explained. So again, you see here we have a superior being has resulted in a virgin birth here, but in Greek religion, they don't want to believe that Philip had any relationship physically with his wife after the god had already done the implementation of a pregnancy. So he had to stay away. And that same idea gets into Christians' heads, and we think, of course, Joseph can't have any children through Mary. Where did these other kids come from? It must be a prior marriage. He's got, I think it's 7 other kids, but we know that's not true, as I mentioned in other episodes. Epiphanes clearly tells us that James is the suzerain after Jesus ascends into heaven. Now the next person in line from Joseph, who's the Davidic heir, he was James. James was the next in line, and he's therefore, Epiphanes explained that's why he's in charge of the church at Jerusalem. Something I didn't really realize until I read that. But anyway, so let's continue. Let's read this section. According to Eratosthenes, so this is an historian, Olympias, when she conducted Alexander on his way in his first expedition, privately discovered to him, meaning told Alexander, the secret of his birth. So he did not even know until his first expedition that this had happened. So he always thought all along that his father was Philip, but instead he's going to learn here his father is a god, and right, and exhorted him to behave with the dignity suitable to his divine extraction. All right, now I'm going to read you the section, page 189 of the book I showed you before, where it's going to mention the Magi. Now, what's interesting about this is the whole thing is very interesting. Listen to every detail. Alexander was born on the 6th of Hecatombion. That's a month in the calendar of Greece, which the Macedonians call Louis, the day on which the temple of Diana at Ephesus was burned. Now, Ephesus is not inside of Macedonia. So Macedonia is actually not part of Greece, just so you know. And neither is Ephesus. What you have, though, is Macedonia is where Alexander is born. Philip is a king there. And Greece is a kingdom to the south of Macedonia. It's going to be conquered. Macedonia actually conquers Greece. And you think the Greek Empire is Greek. It's actually a Macedonian kingdom that Alexander the Great uses the people of Greece to conquer the world at that time, the known world at that time, most of the known world at that time. Anyway, so Ephesus is part of a separate community called Asia, and that doesn't mean it's like China. It means Asia, and it's south of uh, Macedon, physically on latitudes, but it's to the east of Greece. Okay, so you traverse the Aegean Sea to get over to basically it's a peninsula there, a large one though, and Ephesus is kind of centrally located inside of that area, and that's called Asia or Asia Minor sometimes. And there's a temple of Diana there, and that's a very famous temple at that era. And the day he was born, it's actually a fact apparently that the temple of Diana was burned and destroyed that day. So this is a sign maybe of a birth. Would the Magi think this is a sign of his birth? Something tragic happened that day. That's a sign, So just pay attention to the detail at which this is being copied and used to make a news story very similar. Something happened that was monumental that day, and it was in this case it was the temple of Diana at Ephesus burning to the ground, except obviously the concrete and the marble. Upon which occasion Hegesias the Magnesian has uttered a conceit frigid enough to have extinguished the flames. So this guy puts it out with his breath, and then he says, quote, "It is no wonder," said he, "that the temple of Diana was burned when the goddess was at a distance, employing in bringing Alexander into the world." End of quote. So Hegesias was basically, he was a soothsayer, obviously, because his words literally put out the fire. That's what you're supposed to believe. And then he says that the whole point of the fire was because Diana was not serving what she was supposed to doing. She was mediating the birth, the creation of Alexander in the womb of his mother. Now, here's where it gets interesting. All the Magi who were then at Ephesus looked upon the fire as a sign for running some much heavier misfortune. So pay attention. It's the Magi, capital Magi. Now, I believe you could argue this is the magicians or the same type of magi that exist under Babylonian pagan rule. That name became a common term that could be used in for same type of people in other lands, because these lands are not really far distant. Babylon magi, the magi who Daniel knew of. Now we have magi over here in another community, not too distance away. Maybe I haven't measured it out, but it could be gotten there within not an unreasonable period of time. So you have a transmutation of things from the Babylonian Empire over here now into Asia. And what do we see? Magi. The Magi who were then at Ephesus, or were they traveling from Babylonia to here? So it's obvious they're not always at Ephesus. They were then at Ephesus. So the other possibility is they actually had traveled from the east, meaning Babylonia, and they'd come here just like it happened in this story of Jesus. So the word then, who were then at Ephesus, could be very material. It allows an inference that they weren't from Ephesus, that they actually came all the way from Babylonia, which really does make sense of what really is intended here. So all the Magi who were then at Ephesus looked upon the fire as a sign for running some much heavier misfortune. So it's a sign, the temple falling, right? Remember, there's also a sign in the sky of light, the planets, whatever it is that caused them to go in the story of Jesus to go to the west. That's apparently what happened with these magi. They came to the west, and they were at Ephesus when this happened, and they saw the fire. They saw that light, that great big light. They ran about the town, striking their faces and crying, quote, "That day had brought forth the great scourge and destroyer of Asia," end of quote. So what they were prophesying there, see, there's a prophecy in what they said. So that there would be a king was born that day, and this was the augur, or the sign that Alexander the Great had been born, and he would one day conquer Asia, the area where the temple at Ephesus, temple of Diana at Ephesus existed. So they were prophesying that the Magi are that this born child of a virgin would eventually come and destroy and conquer this area of Asia, meaning Asia Minor, inside of modern Western Turkey. Okay, do you see the picture now? This is so dramatically similar. I don't know how you cannot say this is not what inspired whoever wrote it. The Magi story and all that stuff comes right out of this story. It's almost uncanny. All right, so I have other things to say in the future about the virgin birth, but I just came across this recently, and I thought, you know what, this is something we all need to consider as we weigh the situation. Have we been allowed to put in something? Have we permitted something that happened in the 200s to corrupt our Bible? We need to go back to the Syriac Sinaiticus at minimum, which doesn't have any of this. It just has, in Matthew, it's just Joseph begat Jesus, and there's no virgin birth mentioned at all in the book of Luke. All right, God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao.